One. Hello, everyone, from Dunrovin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. My name is Suzanne Miller. I'm the owner of Dunrovin Ranch, and I am delighted to have Jim Robbins with us today. Jim drove over from Helena, Montana, which is about 120 miles to the east, a little bit north, maybe, huh?
No, primarily east.
Primarily east, yeah. Jim is the author of this incredibly interesting and wonderful book entitled The Wonder of Birds. And this book drew my attention because it is a combination book. It talks about some of the science of birds. It talks about some of the mythology of birds and some of the ways in which birds really enhance our life and have served as models for all kinds of developments within the human civilization from the very beginning. And that birds are kind of a unique relationship with people, unlike the relationship we have with our fellow mammals. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your being here.
Oh, it's nice to be here.
So for part of the session, we will talk about birds in general and then slip in a little bit of how the ospreys fit into that perspective. We come at this from very different perspectives. Jim, tell us how you actually got involved with birds. You're not a biologist. Could you give us a little thumbnail sketch?
I am a journalist, and I've written for the New York Times primarily as a science journalist, although I've covered lots of things since 1980, and I've written for a lot of other publications as well. And one of the things I've covered primarily within those 30, well now 40 years almost, is environment and science.
Mm-hmm.
And I got really interested I've always been interested in birds since the first time I went flying with someone who had a peregrine falcon. And but then I did a story in Missoula at the bird lab there, and they capture hummingbirds and diamond doves and other birds, and they study them in wind tunnels and x-ray machines and so on. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times about that, and it captivated me that you could, I don't know, I've always seen birds on the wing flying, but the fact that you could capture them and look at them in detail, in depth, really caught my attention. You know, you could look through them, you could watch them do all of their acrobatics and so on with machinery and technology, and so I mean, it really wowed me. And then to have these researchers tell me that as much as they know, birds are still a mystery, and that really got my attention. And one of my themes in my writing has been how little we know about the natural world. And so what this book and my previous book, The Man Who Planted Trees, were about was about understanding how little we know and how we're doing a lot of damage to the planet that we live on without really knowing what it's all about. And so that's kind of what drove me to write this book about birds.
And Jim divides his book into basically 4 major sections. And let's see if I can remember what the 4 sections are. Part 1, which is what birds tell us about our own natural world, and then what a gift they are to us in their uniqueness within the animal kingdom, and then discovering ourselves through birds, and birds and the hope for a better future. And this was what drew me to your book, Jim, was the fact that you did intermix the biology with its importance and its meaning to us as human beings, and how we can use birds not just as objects of scientific curiosity, but we can learn a lot about ourselves by watching them and by understanding them. And so I kind of like to go through the initial part of our presentation here with your book kind of on some of the chapters and how it might relate to ospreys. And I want to thank our employee, Brianna McAllister, who developed a very nice outline for us to follow and kind of followed through some of your sections of the book and related them to ospreys. So maybe we could go back to your first chapter, which is birds are basically the dinosaurs that made it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and could you tell us a little bit about that topic, the dinosaurs that made it?
Basically, that title describes it. That I think it was in the 1990s, really, when science came to the conclusion that birds were descended from dinosaurs. There was work that had been done a long time before that. People had noticed the certain aspects of the bird seemed to be dinosaur-like, but until some scientists stepped out and said, wait a minute, they're not just like dinosaurs. These are dinosaurs. They've evolved from the dinosaurs of 120, 130 million years ago. They became smaller, and they have the ability to fly, most of them, but they are still dinosaurs. And so when we go out and we go out to the nests or we watch birds flying, we're watching the modern day dinosaur out there. And so many of the attributes of birds are the same attributes of dinosaurs. They have feathers. Feathers weren't for flying originally. They were probably for coloration, for camouflage, for mating purposes, and so on. And they only became used for flight later. The feet are dinosaur feet, adapted to birds. And the beak. I mean, we talk about dinosaurs being able to kill prey and eat meat, and that's what these birds are equipped to do. They're hardwired for hunting, most of them for preying, and so you're looking at a dinosaur right here in front of us.
And going back to your initial comments about being intrigued by what's happening at the bird lab here at the University of Montana, and I have to point out to everybody that the University of Montana has an excellent ornithology department. And ornithology, by the way, is the science of birds. It's the study of birds. And one of the missing links for many, many years between dinosaurs and birds was the evolution of flight and how that came about. Exactly why did dinosaurs take to the air, and how did the wing develop? The wing develop, and I'd like you to relate some of the work that Ken Dial has done in terms of his theory of how that did happen. I think it's a really interesting perspective, and it seems to be the talk of a lot of ornithologists right now, that he has come up with this explanation, and it seems to really hold. Can you explain that to us?
Yep. So there were two schools of thought about why dinosaurs, how they first flew, all based on fossils. And some people thought that they climbed up and glided down, and other people, the other school, that school is called the arboreal, which means that they went up into trees and then they glided down. The other school of thought is cursorial, and that's birds that would run along the ground chasing an insect, and eventually they would fly because they were running so fast. And so the debate was between those two schools of thought. So Ken came along, and he's been studying birds now in the lab for decades, and he understands bird physiology very well. So he went to what he knew. He went to the physiology of living birds or living dinosaurs rather than studying fossils. And the question has always been, when it comes to the first flight of birds, is why would they have wings in the first place? Why would you have a wing if you couldn't fly? It didn't make sense. In fact, some people thought that the fact that birds didn't have wings did have wings was an explanation for that explained away evolution, because they must have been able to fly and were given wings early on. But what Ken came up with is he watched these chucker partridges that he was studying climb bales of hay like experts. When they were 2 days old, 3 days old, these partridges could climb bales of hay, and they could run fast on the ground. And the reason they could is they had a small wing, a half a wing. And what he realized is that half a wing was used to stabilize the bird as it tried to escape predators, as it climbed up hay bales or it climbed up a tree or whatever. What he discovered in the course of this is that birds are excellent climbers. which I think no one knew up until Ken Dial did his work and has all these films of birds climbing. And they can even climb overhangs. He talks about their feet as being like a Leatherman tool with all these different functions. And there are three styles of walking amongst animals in the world. We are one style, and horses are another, and so on. A bird does all three of those. So it's got this incredibly wide array of abilities with its feet. So as he watched these partridges grow up, they started jumping off the top of the hay bales and gliding down to the ground. And what he realized is this is probably how evolution occurred amongst the dinosaurs to create flight. That these birds were born on the ground. They were precocial. There's two types of birds. Those birds that are born on day one or shortly after birth, able to run and climb and so on. And then birds that are altricial, like the osprey, that hatch from an egg and have to be cared for by their parents for a long time before they can fly. These precocial birds would, as he watched them, would run for a while using their wings to stabilize. And as their wings got bigger, they would start jumping off hay bales and so on and gliding. And then eventually they were flying. And that course of things that he watched in his partridges were what he believed happened over millions of years amongst dinosaurs, that they were born with these half-a-wings to stabilize their running, to help them escape prey, and the better they could escape prey, the better they survived. And eventually, the ultimate escape from predators was flying. And so those birds that had bigger wings and could glide and then fly were able to escape predators. And so, as evolution tells us, they're the ones that pass their genes on, and over time, birds began to be able to fly like an osprey, which is amazing. So that was all developed here at the University of Montana. And what Ken has told me and what he says in the book is that we really need to understand the living dinosaur. We study dinosaurs through stone, he said, but we really need to understand that the dinosaurs are still amongst us. And so my argument in the book is that birds give us a way to understand and to study dinosaurs, because they are the birds or the dinosaurs that made it.
It was that missing link evolutionarily that people had a real issue with, and that is the utility of a half wing.
Right.
How did the wing develop over time if it was a useless appendage?
Up until they could fly.
Up until they could fly. And he really just fit that piece in the gap, that it was used as a climbing mechanism at first and then continued its evolution towards, enhancing it. I thought that was very, very clever.
They say the same thing about the eye, as a matter of fact. Why would anybody have an eye that couldn't see that evolved into an eye that became able to see? It doesn't make sense. So it's an argument that God created the eye rather than evolution.
Right.
So that was the same thing with the wing. They said it wouldn't make sense for half a wing, so evolution couldn't be true. God must have made birds fully formed. For a long time, people believed that.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned the word altricial, and an altricial bird is one that is born without the capability of fending for itself. People it takes a long maturation period, a lot of tending by their parents, and that's certainly true of ospreys. Those of you who have been watching the osprey web camera for some time recognize that the ospreys come out covered with a down. Their eyes are open. They can feed immediately, but that's about it. Their mobility is very, very limited, and they go through a rather long maturation period of about 55 days between the time that they're hatched and the time that they're ready to fledge. And those stages are rather distinct. They get to the point where they can begin to use their wings in a practice kind of way. In fact, if you stay watching our web camera throughout the summer, kids, and I hope that you do, you will notice that as the time comes for them to learn to fly, they'll practice fly we call it helicoptering, right at the nest where they'll come up and they'll come down, they'll come up and they'll come down. And I have to tell a little story about last year's first chick that was helicoptering and fell off of the nest, didn't quite land appropriately, and fell onto the roof of our barn. And she was fine. She stayed there for quite a while, got enough air to get into the forest, but not to get up to the nest. And the next day, she found her way back to the nest. So it's a long maturation period, but that is common among birds of prey or raptors. That the chicks are born unable to fend for themselves immediately.
And I would say, by comparison, there's a bird called the Australian bush turkey or brush turkey, and on the very first day of life, the brush turkey have these great nests, and they're 6 feet tall, and they put compost in under the nest, and it warms the eggs. And the male turkey will come around, he'll put his beak into the compost to take the temperature, and he'll turn it and try and warm it up or cool it down. And then when the eggs hatch, on day one, the Australian brush turkey isn't just precocial, it's super precocial is the term for that. On the first day, they can run and escape predators better and climb better than the adults can.
Isn't that phenomenal?
It's phenomenal. It takes 55 days for an osprey to fly, but Australian brush turkey on day one. And of course, it's an adaptation to ground nesting.
Right.
Because you're born on the ground, and you need to be able to be up and running and escape whatever it is on the first day. So
let me ask you about the incubation period then of the ground nesting turkey. Do you know what the incubation?
I don't know how long of a period it is.
That would be an interesting question, students. You might want to look that up.
Right.
Because the incubation period for an osprey, and the incubation period means the time between when the egg is laid and when it hatches, is somewhere between 34 and 42 days. I'll bet it's longer.
Mm-hmm.
So for all that to occur within the egg as opposed to outside of the egg.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I did not know about that. Let's talk about flight and the magic of flight. And in a moment, we'll talk about what makes ospreys unique in terms of their flight. But one of the things that you talk about is the whole aerodynamic principle that it allows. And again, this is something that has been studied in the lab here at the University of Montana because they have wind tunnels. But could you describe a little of that for us? What it is that allows a bird to fly?
Same thing that allows an airplane to fly, which is that the air on the bottom is pushing up on the bird, and the air on top is pushing down, but the air from the bottom is flowing around the bird like it would an airplane, and then when it does that, it keeps the bird aloft. Yeah. So it's a very simple thing that birds have learned to master. At the bird lab in Missoula, I watched them put hummingbirds in wind tunnels and put them in these plexiglass cages with strobe lights, and all to study exactly how hummingbirds are the most amazing flyers of all. That's why they study them there. But what really interested me is, you get on an airplane, you can fly across the world, and you can do all these things that even when I was a kid you couldn't do. But Ken Dial and Brett Tobalski, who runs the lab now, put it in perspective when they said, yes, that's true. He said, but a bird can fly along at 40 miles an hour and land on a cattail and go from 40 to 0. And we have got nothing that comes close to that. Birds still are the masters of the sky. Yeah. And we need to kind of appreciate the fact that there's so much that they can do. And Ken likes to talk about how they are masters of instability, that to fly, you must be able to master an unstable system because it's not simple, it's very complex. And a bird is always kind of on the edge, unless it's gliding, it's always on the edge of instability. And so it needs to kind of use that because there's so many moving pieces in a bird to keep it flying. Yeah,
and the amount of energy that is used by birds in flying, I mean, their migration routes and the amount of time that they can spend in the air is really, truly phenomenal. Some migrations are tens of thousands of miles. The Arctic Tern, for
Non-stop.
example, nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
The Arctic Tern will start in the southern hemisphere and end up in Iceland, 10,000 miles away, and over a 3-week period, and arrive. And as you all know, ospreys migrate, or at least some ospreys migrate. Not all ospreys do migrate. The main difference between those that migrate and those that don't migrate is where they breed. Those that breed in areas where water freezes during the winter are not resident here year-round. So the ospreys that come to Montana are migratory. Then they tend to arrive somewhere around the end of March, and they will leave around mid-September to go back to their wintering grounds where water does not freeze. And most of the tagging of birds in this area have been tracked to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's anywhere around the Gulf of Mexico, including Nicaragua, Central America, Florida, Texas, that area. So most of the birds are the ones that we know about from Montana migrate to the south. In talking about osprey's flight, there are a number of things that are unique to their flight, and one of them is their elbow on the wing. And here's an osprey wing. An osprey wingspan can be up to 6 feet, which enables soaring and hovering. And when an osprey is looking for its dinner, which is a fish, it has some adaptations in terms of its own body that enable it to be really the superb fisherman of all. And one of those adaptations is, number one, they can fold their wings in to drop very fast. So an osprey will fly over the river, and unlike humans, first of all, they can see 5 times more clearly than humans can, and they automatically adjust for the distortion, the optical distortion of the water. When you're looking down on something, where a fish appears is not where the fish is, because of the refraction of the light through the water. And they automatically make that adjustment. And then in order to be able to fall out of the sky, they tuck their wings, and they can completely submerge themselves in the water and catch a fish at a depth of up to 3 feet in the water. And then to come and climb out. Now they have a fish which may weigh as much as it does. They've been, I think the largest fish that has been known to have been caught by an osprey was over 2.5 pounds. That's a lot of weight for an osprey to be carrying.
You know what an osprey weighs?
Pardon?
How much does an osprey weigh?
About that range, 3 pounds, something of that nature. Don't quote me on that. I'll look it up though in a moment. Okay. But in order to get out of the water, most water birds use the water surface almost like a landing or takeoff field, like a deck. Will step on the surface of the water to break the surface tension and gain air. But the osprey's elbow here, the carpal portion of the wing, allows it, instead of doing this, to come up and do this. And so it captures a lot more air and a lot more lift on those initial strokes coming out of the water. So that's just one of many adaptations that an osprey has for catching fish. One of the other major adaptations that osprey have are in the form of its feet. Can you tell us something about birds' feet in general? There are a number of different kinds of birds' feet, are there not?
There's many different kind of bird feet, but they all have operate on the same principle in the sense that they can do a whole wide range of things that most other animals' feet cannot do. for climbing, for killing, for perching. So it's a quite an instrument. I mentioned that it was considered to be the Leatherman of the foot world, that it can do all these functions that has not been really well studied. And Ken Dial, again at the University of Montana, says that he really thinks that we should pay more attention to bird feet and to learn more about how they use their feet, which is pretty incredible.
Well, the interesting thing about ospreys, it's not totally unique to ospreys. I believe owls can do this as well, and that is they can turn one of their toes, like we do our thumb, and this enables them to carry their fish like a torpedo. They turn their toe around to match with the other toe and carry let me see if I have a pencil. They can carry it like this, as opposed to other birds. If you look at eagles, they carry it like this, which makes it much more aerodynamically sound to get the fish up out of the water. In addition, you can feel the bottom of this osprey's hook. Jake, can you come in on the osprey hook? I'll give him a few minutes to dial in on it. Hold it still. But it's equipped with several things that make it very efficient at grabbing fish. There is the fact that it can move the toe around to become prehensile like our thumb. And then you want to feel those talons, Jim? Sharp as hooks.
Wow.
Very sharp as hooks. And then if you want to feel the bottom of the feet themselves, those are spiculas, which are tiny little nodes that feel like sandpaper. I mean, they have the texture of sandpaper, which means a slippery fish. They stick to a slippery fish. And in fact, ospreys can get into trouble by not being able to let go of a fish. And if they catch a fish that is too big for it, they can get into trouble because they can't let it go easily. And that's another reason, sometimes eagles will attack ospreys for their fish. And there are pictures of eagles turning over upside down in flight and grabbing the fish out of the talons of an osprey. And that can be a cause for mortality in the osprey because he can't just let go of the fish. Yeah, they're very, very well adapted to being fishermen. Some of the other ways in which ospreys, you want to bring the camera up on this osprey, Jake? Some of the other ways in which ospreys are very well adapted is in order to dive in the water, they have to be able to close off their nostrils. There's a flap that they close off when they dive into the water. Otherwise, the water would go right up into their nostrils. So they have special nostrils, and then they have a nictitating membrane on top of their eyes, which they close and cover, and it protects their eyes during a dive. It also protects their eyes during flight. And I don't know if you've been able to watch our osprey through the web camera, but during close-ups you can actually see the different eyelids. It's a clear eyelid that comes over the eye. It doesn't come down, it comes to the sides as opposed to coming down. And that protects the osprey during diving in the water and during flight. So those are really the basic adaptations. Its wing structure, the fact that it has a flap that can close its nostrils, its feet structure, the sandpaper on the pads, those sharp talons, and then the ability to protect their eyes in water. Okay, Jim, I'd like you to
Hey, Suzanne?
Pardon?
Hey, Suzanne, this is Jake from online, and we have some questions from some fourth graders.
Okay, far away. That'd be great.
We just have one in particular that asks you a personal question about the osprey that has been at Dunrovin. Which is your personal favorite osprey, Hal, Harriet, or Ozzy?
Well, I have to say I've known Harriet for the longest, and I've seen her endure all of the trials. So I have to say I have a real affection for the matriarch Harriet. And let me tell Jim about Harriet, Hal, and Ozzy. And I'm really glad to see that you fourth graders have read about the history of the Dunrovin ospreys. When they first came, we named them Ozzy and Harriet, and this was in 2011 when the web camera first was put up. And then in the late summer of 2014, Ozzy was killed, probably by an eagle looking for a fish. We found Ozzy's body and we took it to Montana Wild, where this bird came from. Montana Wild is a museum-like wildlife education center in Helena, and he is protecting a nest over there. And during the time that Ozzy was missing, Harriet stepped up her activity and fed the chicks and got them fledged that year. And then the next year she looked for a new mate, and Hal showed up. And while we love Ozzy and Hal very much, I'm really attached to Harriet. She's been through it all.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other questions?
Lauren would like to know if other schools have given any options for the babies' names and how we decide on the ospreys' names when they are hatched.
Oh, that's a good question. Very frequently, our online community discusses what to name the chicks, and it's almost always in reference to something that was unique to them that year, something unique to the time in which they hatched or were laid, something along those lines. So let's dial back to 2012. In 2012, the chicks, they laid 2 eggs. Ozzy and Harriet laid 2 eggs that did not hatch. And that's unusual, but not unheard of. In talking to wildlife biologists who study ospreys, about 20%, at least this was the information I got from the Idaho fishing game, about 20% do have, in any given particular year, the eggs don't hatch, somewhere along that percentage. So they didn't hatch. So the next year, Ozzy and Harriet had 3 eggs, and everybody was so excited that the eggs hatched that the names were given to the 3 osprey were Hope, because they had to have hope to come back and lay their eggs, Perseverance, because they persevered, and Diligence, Dilly, because they were diligent parents. And the next year, the eggs hatched. We had 3 eggs. The eggs were laid, I believe, during a lunar eclipse, right around a lunar eclipse. So we named them Shadow, Lunar, and Solar. I believe Sol, Lunar, and Shadow. And then the next year, the chicks hatched right around Memorial Day, and so we gave them military names, Hope and Glory. And then the next batch of chicks, gosh, my memory is really getting bad here. Oh, last year's chicks were really fun. We named them Hawk, Hoot, and Hero. And that was because the whole spring season, within 4 days, it was an exciting beginning to our season. We had a goose take over the nest. The goose laid an egg in the nest. Harriet came and chased the goose off out of nowhere. She was like a bomb out of the sky. And then she was stuck with this goose egg in her nest, and we thought, oh dear, what's she going to do with that? And during that period of time, I might mention, I read on goose eggs in ospreys' nests, and goose eggs have actually hatched in ospreys' nests. This is not an unheard of occurrence. And anyway, a raven came and stole the goose egg. Okay, So the hawk was from the goose, the hero was from the raven who took the egg, and then hoot was because that very night after the raven stole the egg, Harriet was attacked by a great horned owl at night while she was on her perch. So the beginning of the season ended up with 3 birds, within a 4-day period, and Harriet prevailed. So that's how we name our chicks. And anybody's happy. We're happy to accept suggestions and participate with anybody who wants to chime in when the chicks are born.
The only thing different is that Ozzie and Harriet are named after a couple on a sitcom from when
Yes.
we were kids and we watched television.
Exactly right.
It was a married couple, and they were named Ozzie and Harriet.
Yeah, and Ozzie because of the Ozzie Osprey.
Ah.
That was the reason for doing that. Any other questions, Jake?
Yes, we have a couple of people would like to know about why the female osprey is bigger than the male osprey, and if a male osprey and a female osprey were born at the same time, why would the female grow up to be bigger?
Well, a difference in the size in birds of prey is very common. The female, I assume that it is associated with the production of eggs, at her larger size.
I don't know.
Yeah,
don't know
I
why the
believe that
females are
that's the case, but that's another question that I will look up. Why they believe that the birds of prey, the female is commonly larger than the male. Birds that are hatched at the same time, the female will present herself larger, will grow larger, and you can tell the difference commonly by number one, females and ospreys have a darker necklace around their neck, but also size is an indication of the gender of the birds that we can see through our web cameras. And I want to say something about our web cameras and how it relates to one of the topics in Jim's book, and that is we've all heard about canaries in the mine and birds as sentinels to environmental quality. And I'll ask Jim to address that for a moment, and then I'll relate that back to why we have a web camera to begin with. Can you tell us something about that?
Why birds are sentinels?
Yes.
Well, they live on rivers, the osprey particularly, but birds are sensitive because they depend on nature. They're sensitive to environmental changes. Yes. And so we can notice the canary in the coal mine, the saying canary in the coal mine came from when miners, up until the 1980s, would take little canaries with them down into the mine, and when the methane in the mine began to get poisonous, canaries are very sensitive to methane, and the bird would drop off its perch because it was overwhelmed with gas. The miners would say, it's time to leave and get out of the mine because gas levels are building up. And so it's become a metaphor. Everyone says, I'm the canary in the mine or whatever. But birds are the canaries in the mine in a way, because they tell us a lot about what's going on in the world. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas said, if we paid attention to what the birds have to tell us, they tell us all this stuff for free if we can interpret what they're telling us. And so it might be osprey that are picking up lead levels along a river because there's high lead levels in the fish and in the river, or it might be birds that are picking up mercury which they're looking at bird wings because they get high levels of mercury from eating fish, and so on. Birds can tell us a lot about the world, and actually that's the theme of my book, is that if we know how to interpret birds, whether it's to tell us about ourselves or tell us about poisons in the world or whatever it is, we can learn a lot. We just have to kind of be creative with how we interpret them and how we come to understand them and what they do.
And your reference to mercury in the water, that's exactly why we do have a web camera here. Back in 2010, 2 University of Montana professors started a project looking at mercury levels, primarily in the Clark Fork River, because the Clark Fork River is downstream from a lot of mining activity. And the reason for the web camera is they wanted to identify and count the number of fish that were delivered that the chicks ate. And then they were able to capture the chicks and take blood samples from their wings and determine the amount of mercury and other heavy metals in their blood. And they approached us about putting a web camera over our nest because we are not on the Clark Fork. The Bitterroot was considered a cleaner stream because we have less mining activity at the headwaters. There's been some in the way up in the mountains in the Bitterroots, but not a large mine like there is in the Clark Fork. And they were surprised by the results. And the birds accumulate these things in their blood, and that allows the scientists then to look at looking only at the chicks. The adults, because the adults fly to Mexico, have to the Gulf of Mexico, have fish in their blood from all over the place, but the chicks eat only the fish that are caught by their parents during that period of time that they're being fed, which is within several miles of the nest. And by looking at the individual fish, the scientists could tell where the fish came from. For example, here at Dunrovin, most of the fish come out of the river, but some of them do not. There's a species of fish that's in a lake just nearby here, little sunfish that are unique, and do not occur in the river, so they could identify where the fish had come from. But that was why we put the web camera above the osprey's nest. And I want to tell you that when we did that, the original osprey's nest was on the electrical poles that come out to our property. And when the university called us, they also called Northwest Energy. Northwest Energy has a very active osprey program because it is not uncommon for ospreys to choose electrical wires for nest building. And of course, it can be dangerous, not just for the birds, but for the electrical energy as well. Many osprey have died in electrical wires. Their wingspan touches two of them and they electrocute themselves. So Northwest Energy got involved and said, well, we don't want you putting a web camera above an osprey's nest on an electrical pole. So they came and installed this 45-foot pole on our property and moved the nest. And the interesting thing about when they moved the nest is they estimated its weight to be between 350 and 400 pounds. And that nest has been here for a very, very long time. And I know some of you school children have heard the chirping that goes on even when the osprey are totally quiet. And that's because the little birds have discovered that this is a perfect place to build their nest because the osprey act as protectors. You may have heard during the time that you're watching the osprey chirp, chirp, chirp. That means that there's a bird of prey in the area and they don't want it coming over near their nest. Well, that is a way of protecting not only the osprey and their chick, but those little birds understand that as well and make their nests in the catacombs of the larger nest. It's full of birds. It's a condominium going on up there. It's really quite exciting. Jake, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we have quite a few. The gray spots in the osprey's eyes, will they affect their vision? And this is from a different school.
Well, I can't answer that question. The dark black spots, Harriet has a lot of them in her eyes. In fact, it's her eyes that allow me to identify her as the same bird because they don't change from year to year. Ospreys are molt year-round, and that's because they're birds of prey. They can't afford a period of time in which they can't fly. Some birds molt all at once, and they can't fly. Some of the birds that migrate to the Arctic, for example, they'll be ground-bound for a time because they're molting. But birds of prey don't do that. So you can't always tell by the coloration of the bird whether it's the same bird or not.
That's one of the interesting things about feathers is that feathers are not only incredible in their own right, they're tough, they're light, birds can fly with them, but they get new ones all the time. Right, they're constantly renewing themselves. It's really quite a miracle.
It is, and that's part of the preening process, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, they get preen oils in there, and it protects the feather, keeps them, part of what keeps them preen wax, I think they call it. They take it and they spread it through their feathers, and it's part of what makes them waterproof.
Yeah.
Is
They have a gland.
right?
And you may have seen the osprey preening, and you'll see them over their shoulder, and they're putting their beak in there to get some of the gland,
right.
and then
and spreading it on their feathers.
Yeah, spreading.
And then when they dive into the water, they shed water because they have this preen wax on, or preen oil on their feathers.
Yeah.
Birds are truly I mean, if you think about them as a kind of technology designed to be able to hunt fish,
Yes.
it's quite amazing. It's a living technology, but it's still quite things we could never invent as people, I think.
Absolutely. Okay, the next question, Jake?
We have a question for Jim about when people found out that birds were related to dinosaurs. I think they missed the first part. Could you summarize that information again, please?
Well, there's been speculation that birds are somehow related to dinosaurs since the late 1800s. They have similar bones. Bones are hollow. But for a long time, people thought that they were lizards, that they were reptiles. Dinosaur means, or not dinosaur, but Tyrannosaurus, I think, means terrible lizard. And so people thought they were reptiles for a long time, but it wasn't until the 80s or 90s, 1980s and 1990s, that people began to say, wait a minute, they weren't cold-blooded, they're warm-blooded. And a friend of mine who was a researcher started drawing dinosaurs differently. Instead of seeing them as these big, ponderous animals with a dragging tail, he started drawing them and painting them upright with the tail up and their front paws out. And so they look much more like a bird than a dinosaur, or excuse me, a bird than a reptile. And that was when the change happened, the 80s and 90s, and science said that these, in fact, some of the work done at the Montana State University with Jack Horner at the museum, he found dinosaur nests that had eggs in them. He named the dinosaur, which is our state dinosaur, Maiasaur, which means good mother dinosaur. But they behaved like birds. They had a nest full of eggs. They were good mothers. They raised their young. And so that was when we made the shift from reptiles to birds. And they are very bird-like, and they are the descendants of the dinosaurs that are living amongst us.
One of the things I wanted to show people that they sent over from wild Montana is an osprey's egg. Can you bring it in, Jake? Yeah, it's in my hand. And the reason I show it to you is this particular year, we have a very deep, deep nest cup. And the web cameras had a very difficult time seeing the eggs.
It's very beautiful.
Yeah, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
This has been coated with a preservative, and so the colors are not quite true to form. Osprey eggs have been called Christmas eggs because these spots are actually more reddish than what appear in my hand.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that through the web camera when you can see the eggs. They've been really good at hiding their eggs this year. But this is about the size. You can see it in my hand. And they're very beautiful. And in fact, you might want to address this, Jim. For many years, birds were endangered because of people stealing eggs and taking feathers and using parts of birds. Can you address that in the history of birds?
Well, there is a group now. I think there was a big story about the arrests that were made. There are some people, especially in England, people are obsessive about birds in England and Australia, as I found. I was just in Australia, and people are very obsessive about birds. But there's an even smaller group of people who love eggs, and they go all over the countryside, and they have these giant egg collections of all these different eggs. And it's against the law, and you can't steal eggs from a bird. And there was just a bust. I think they had an undercover agent who found that these guys were stealing eggs, and they arrested them and prosecuted them. But yeah, eggs particularly are so beautiful and symbolic, I think, that people obsess about them. I have an emu egg, a very large one. Actually, from just down the road here in Hamilton, there's an emu ranch, and it's about that big, and it's it's kind of a greenish black, and it's like one of my pride and joys because it's so beautiful,
Yeah.
and it represents life because this is where the baby birds come from. So,
But during before conservation was sort of a national focus, birds were endangered because people were stealing their eggs. And I know I lived in Alaska for a number of years, and on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, where thousands of geese come to molt and breed, the native people knew to be very careful about how many eggs they would use. They were definitely a source of protein, but they were very, very careful. You know, if there was a clutch of 4, they would take 1, recognizing that if you take all the eggs, pretty soon you won't have them coming back the next year. So conservation works if done appropriately.
I want to go back for just a minute till we talked about the bird feathers.
Yes.
And I don't know if the audience knows that bird feathers are made from keratin, which is the same protein that our hair is made out of and our fingernails. Yes. And it's a very strong, light protein that helps protect them, but it also helps them fly and helps them make a living eating fish. So it's a very interesting material, and the natural world wouldn't be possible without it, because of so many animals use keratin for really important duties, nails and so on, to protect the different animals, have horns and so on made out of it. So it's really, and the beak as well of an osprey is made out of keratin. It's very powerful, very strong, yet very light at the same time. And birds really need to have the lightest materials out there because they need to be able to fly.
Any more questions, Jake?
We've covered quite a bit. They're really glad that you're answering them live.
That's great. Well, we're really excited to have all of you. And even though the project is ending, that doesn't mean that your watching the birds has to end. You can go to Dunrovin, days@dunrovin.com at any time. It's open to the public. The bird camera is open to the public. Our chat is not open to the public, but the bird camera is. And you can watch from home, children, as the chicks mature. And I encourage you to do that. There are a couple of things that I want to prepare you for, however, and that is we have 3 eggs in our nest, and very commonly when we have that many eggs, we may end up with what is known as sibling rivalry in birds of prey. And sibling rivalry means that the mother bird doesn't really distinguish which bird she feeds. She feeds the one that's closest to her, the one that can put its mouth closest to her. And oftentimes, the last chick to hatch can't survive because of the rivalry of its 2 larger chicks if there's any interruption in food. And interruptions in food for osprey can come because of stream conditions, primarily flooding, which we are experiencing right now. Now, our HAL has been very able to provide Harriet with enough fish to keep her going, but in previous years we have had 3 chicks where 1 did not survive because right at some critical periods, the male bird was unable to bring enough fish to keep them all healthy. And that's common in birds, is it not? That, better to have 1 or 2 chicks that is really strong and able to survive than to feed all 3 chicks uniformly and have 3 sickly chicks. And that's just a fact of nature. It's really tough to fledge. I mean, the probability of fledging is less than 50% of becoming an adult bird.
In a bald eagle nest, the 3rd bird, same thing. The 3rd bird is often pushed out of the nest.
Yeah.
They call it a terminal eagle.
Yeah.
And the guy I interviewed in one of the chapters, he went around and adopted some of those terminal eagles and used them to repopulate bald eagles along the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. That's where he got them because
That's it.
they were just going to die anyway.
That's right.
And so he would take them and use them for reintroduction.
Yeah, what a good use.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but oftentimes they die in the nest. We've had that happen here. I just want to warn you that sometimes it's difficult to watch. The youngest chick not get enough, but we've also had clutches where all three survived and did very well. And it's really when you have uncertain food sources that this kind of a mechanism is a way that birds adapt to that, to make sure that at least all this energy and all this effort that they've put into creating the next generation, at least one or two survive.
You know what the success rate for osprey?
I don't, but I'm not exactly. I will look that up as well. It's not high. You
Or
know,
maybe half of the birds.
half of the birds. Yeah, that's right. Less than half.
Those are the ones that survive to
That
adulthood.
survive. That's right. It'll take about 55 days from the time that they hatch. The incubation period is 34 to 42 days, and since our eggs were laid on April 24, 26, and 29, we should expect that around the 1st of June. And one of the things that is also really interesting about these web cameras is that we are learning a great deal about the variation among ospreys and their behavior. You know, it's one thing to learn about osprey populations. It's another thing to learn about individuals. And this has opened a window onto ospreys as individuals. There are enough web cameras on different osprey nests throughout the world that you can now compare the ways in which the ospreys deal with mating, deal with raising their young, and they're all different. They all have unique personalities, just like all of us do. And it's really opening science's eyes.
That's a growing part of biology these days, is factoring personalities into biology. I've done a lot of stories on wolves in Yellowstone, and the biologists there told me when a wolf is killed and another wolf comes in, it's a totally different thing because that new wolf, if it's an alpha female, alpha male, has a totally different personality.
Yeah.
So all the other wolves behave differently toward it. But
Yeah.
they have no way really to factor in personalities into
Right.
science. So it's
Right.
a new frontier.
It is. It's an exciting time for wildlife biology, isn't it?
It is.
Well, it's 3 o'clock. Do we have any last questions, Jake?
I think we're good. Everyone is really happy to hear about the stories.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Jim for coming.
Oh, you're
What
welcome.
a delight. And thank you for writing this wonderful book. If you have not purchased and read this book, I encourage you to do it over the summer, now that you know a little bit about birds. And the nice thing, as I said before, is it's a book that is not just about the science, but it's about what birds can tell us about nature, what it can tell us about ourselves, and there's just so many fun and interesting anecdotal stories about a variety of birds. It's just a great, enjoyable read. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you all for coming, and have a great summer. I hope to see you at the nest. Thank you. Bye.